Black pilot's brilliance stuns passengers, engine repair saves flight. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Captain Marcus Johnson's voice remained steady over the intercom despite the violent shaking of the aircraft. The 737's right engine had just made a sound no pilot ever wants to hear. A deep, guttural bang followed by an uneven whine that sent vibrations through the entire fuselage. In the cabin, a wave of gasps and screams rippled through the passengers. A businessman in first class gripped his armrests, knuckles white. "Jesus Christ, we're going down," he muttered, eyes wide with terror. 3 rows behind him, Dr. Sarah Chen, an aerospace engineer returning from a conference, felt her stomach drop not just from the sudden altitude change, but from recognition. That sound. She'd heard it in simulations, but never on an actual flight. The engine wasn't just malfunctioning, it was experiencing a rare and potentially catastrophic failure. In the cockpit, First Officer Peter Reynolds shot a panicked glance at Marcus. "Captain, we've lost 30% thrust on the right engine. Readings are all over the place." Marcus's dark hands moved with precision over the controls, his mind racing through emergency protocols while simultaneously calculating their position. 253 miles from Denver, 189 miles from the nearest viable airport in Cheyenne. "Pan, pan, 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 pan." Marcus began the urgent but not yet desperate mayday call, his voice betraying none of the fear constricting his chest. "This is Trans-American Flight 2276 declaring an urgency situation. We have right engine inconsistency and are requesting priority landing clearance at Cheyenne Regional." As air traffic control responded, Marcus made another rapid assessment. The engine parameters were deteriorating by the second. At this rate, they might not make it to Cheyenne. His mind flashed to the 157 souls on board, families returning from vacations, business people heading home, the high school debate team in the back who'd been so excited to board. All lives now resting in his hands, all trusting him to make the right decision. A decision that, given his unique knowledge, might have to break every protocol in the book. "Sir," the flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom. "Passengers are asking what's happening. Some are praying." Marcus took a deep breath. 22 years of flying, thousands of hours in the cockpit, a lifetime of being underestimated. It had all led to this moment, a moment where people's assumptions about him could cost lives. The engine made another terrible sound and the plane lurched again. Marcus could feel the aircraft wanting to bank right, fighting against his controls. In the cabin, Dr. Chen was studying the wing through her window. The vibration patterned the sound. It was an anomaly she'd only read about in theoretical papers. A solution existed, but it wasn't in any standard emergency procedure. As if reading her thoughts, the captain's voice came over the intercom again, steady but urgent. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a technical issue with our right engine. I need everyone to remain calm and seated." There was a pause, then he continued. "I also need to know if there is an aerospace engineer or someone with specialized knowledge of the Pratt & Whitney PW1000G geared turbofan engine on board. If so, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." The request was unprecedented. Commercial pilots didn't ask passengers for technical help. It went against every procedure, every protocol. But Marcus Johnson had recognized something in the engine's behavior that told him this was no ordinary failure. In Seat 9C, Dr. Chen's hand shot up even as murmurs of confusion and fear spread through the cabin. A flight attendant rushed to her. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, Propulsion Systems Specialist at NASA's Glenn Research Center. I work with that exact engine model." As the flight attendant relayed this information to the cockpit, Marcus made a decision that would either save everyone on board or end his career, possibly both. "Bring her up here," he ordered. In first class, the businessman who'd predicted their doom, Richard Whitfield, scoffed loudly. "A black pilot asking passengers for help. We're completely screwed." His seatmate, an elderly woman named Ruth Goldstein, fixed him with a stern gaze. "Man, I survived the 6-day war by trusting people who knew what they were doing, regardless of what they looked like. I suggest you do the same." As Dr. Chen was escorted to the cockpit, the plane began to descend through clouds, the faulty engines whine growing more erratic. They were running out of time, and whatever happened next would challenge everyone's preconceptions about capability, authority, and who we choose to trust when our lives hang in the balance. Marcus tightened his grip on the controls. He'd spent his entire career proving people wrong. Now it wasn't just his reputation at stake, it was the lives of everyone on this aircraft. The cockpit door opened, and Dr. Chen stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the chaos of warning lights and alarms. Their gazes met two experts in a crisis, both used to having their abilities questioned for different reasons. In that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. What happened next would either be a miracle of human ingenuity or a tragedy born of human error. And the difference might just come down to whether the passengers and crew could look past their biases and trust in the expertise of the black man at the controls. Marcus Johnson had always been fascinated by flight. As a child growing up in the south side of Chicago, he would look up at the jets leaving O'Hare, tracing their paths with his finger against the sky. His father, James Johnson, had been a mechanic in the Air Force, never a pilot, though he'd wanted to be. They weren't letting many black men fly back then, he'd told Marcus. But times are changing. You could do it. By 16, Marcus was working after school at a small municipal airport, sweeping hangars and washing planes in exchange for occasional lessons. By 22, he had his commercial license, one of only a handful of black pilots in his graduating class. Now at 45, Captain Marcus Johnson had logged over 18,000 flight hours, earned the respect of most who flew with him, and still faced passengers who did a double take when they saw him in the captain's chair. First Officer Peter Reynolds was one of the good ones. 10 years younger than Marcus, he'd been assigned to fly with him 6 months ago and had quickly developed a genuine respect for the captain's methodical precision and encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft systems. "Captain," Peter said now, his voice strained as he tried to maintain the professional calm they'd been trained for. "The right engine vibration is increasing. Temperature's climbing too." Marcus nodded, his focus intense as he continued to fly the aircraft manually. The autopilot had been disengaged the moment the engine started behaving erratically. "Dr. Chen," he said, addressing the NASA engineer standing behind them, "I believe we're experiencing a rare harmonic resonance in the geared turbofan." The symptoms match a theoretical failure mode I read about in an engineering journal. Sarah Chen's eyes widened in surprise. "You're familiar with the Dixon-Watanabe paper on harmonic destabilization?" "I am," Marcus replied without taking his eyes off the instruments. "I've actually corresponded with Dr. Watanabe about it. The PW1000G has a potential vulnerability where certain vibration patterns can cause the gearbox to enter a self-reinforcing oscillation." Peter looked between them, confusion evident. This was far beyond standard pilot knowledge. Dr. Chen moved closer, studying the engine readouts. "You're right, classic signs of harmonic resonance, but the procedure to correct it isn't in any flight manual." "No, it's not," Marcus agreed, "which is why I needed someone who would understand what I'm about to do." In the main cabin, tension had reached a breaking point. The plane continued to shake, occasionally dropping in altitude enough to make stomachs lurch. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, maintaining forced smiles while checking seatbelts and securing loose items. In first class, Richard Whitfield had pulled out his phone, ignoring instructions to keep devices off. "I'm recording this," he announced to those around him. "When this incompetent pilot crashes us, I want there to be a record." Ruth Goldstein, the elderly woman beside him, shook her head. "Put that away, young man. You're just making things worse." "You don't understand," Whitfield snapped. "My brother-in-law is a pilot. He says diversity hires are killing the airline industry, unqualified people getting jobs they can't handle." 3 rows back, a middle-aged black woman named Evelyn Washington overheard him and turned around, her eyes flashing with anger. "Excuse me? My son is a commercial airline pilot, and he graduated top of his class at the Air Force Academy." "What exactly are you implying?" Whitfield flushed but doubled down. "I'm implying that standards get lowered for certain people. That's just reality." "The reality," Evelyn replied coldly, "is that black pilots have to be twice as good to get half the respect. So whoever's flying this plane has probably forgotten more about aviation than your brother-in-law ever knew." In row 15, the high school debate team from Lincoln Preparatory Academy in Chicago sat clustered together. Among them was Deshaun Morris, a junior with dreams of becoming a pilot himself. He'd been thrilled to discover Captain Johnson was flying their plane, having read about him in a magazine feature on pioneering black aviators. "Ms. Abernathy," Deshaun whispered to his debate coach, "do you think we're going to be okay?" Rebecca Abernathy, a veteran teacher who'd chaperoned dozens of trips, squeezed his hand. "Captain Johnson has an excellent reputation. I looked him up when I saw his name on our boarding passes. 22 years of flying without a single incident." Deshaun nodded, trying to take comfort in the statistics. "I want to be like him someday." "And you will be," Ms. Abernathy assured him, even as the plane shuddered around them. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Marcus, Peter, and Dr. Chen were engaged in an intense technical discussion. The standard procedure would be to shut down the engine, Peter argued. Which would be catastrophic in this situation, Marcus countered. The harmonic resonance has already affected the gearbox. A standard shutdown would likely cause a seizure, possibly throwing fragments into the fuselage. Dr. Chen nodded. He's right. We need to break the resonance pattern first, then power down gradually. How do we do that? Peter asked. Marcus's hands hovered over the throttle controls. We need to introduce a counter-frequency. Essentially, we need to make the engine stutter in a controlled pattern to disrupt the harmonic buildup. That's completely unauthorized, Peter said, his voice rising. It's not in any manual. No, Marcus agreed, but it's sound engineering. Dr. Chen, would you concur with this approach? Sarah studied the engine data, running calculations in her head. Yes, it's our best option, but the timing has to be perfect. Too slow and the resonance continues building. Too fast and you could shock the system into catastrophic failure. Marcus took a deep breath. I've simulated this. I've studied this failure mode extensively because I find turbofan engineering fascinating. I know I can execute this maneuver. Peter hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the expertise Marcus was demonstrating. Captain, I have to officially register my objection to deviating from emergency procedures. Noted, Marcus said, and I respect that, Peter. But right now I need you to trust me and follow my instructions precisely. Over the intercom, air traffic control's voice crackled. Trans-American 2276 Cheyenne approach. We show you descending through 24,000 feet. Emergency services standing by. Can you maintain current descent rate? Cheyenne approach, Trans-American 2276, Marcus responded. Be advised we are attempting to stabilize the engine before approach. We'll update on status. He then turned to his flight crew. Peter, I need you to call out engine parameters exactly as I ask for them. Dr. Chen, please verify my sequence. As Marcus began the delicate process of introducing counterfrequencies to the failing engine, the unusual throttle manipulations caused the plane to shake even more violently for several seconds. In the cabin, screams erupted as oxygen masks dropped from overhead in several rows due to the sudden pressure fluctuation. We're going to crash, someone shouted, triggering more panic. The chief flight attendant, Sofia Rodriguez, grabbed the intercom. Everyone remain calm and seated. The captain is handling a technical issue. This is standard procedure. It wasn't standard procedure at all, but her authoritative tone helped quiet some of the panic. Back in first class, Richard Whitfield was recording the chaos on his phone. This is criminal negligence, he narrated. This airline will be hearing from my lawyers if we survive. Ruth Goldstein had had enough. She reached over, plucked the phone from his hand, and dropped it into her water glass. Oops, how clumsy of me. Whitfield sputtered in outrage, but Ruth just closed her eyes and began to quietly recite what sounded like a prayer in Hebrew. Throughout the aircraft, passengers reacted according to their natures. Some prayed, some cried, some sat in stoic silence. Parents comforted children, strangers held hands, and a few, like Whitfield, lashed out in fear. In row 28, a retired Marine named John Fuentes calmly explained to those around him, I've been in worse situations. The fact that we're still flying means the pilot knows what he's doing. Trust the training. His words offered reassurance to some, but as the minutes ticked by and the plane continued to shake and descend, even the most optimistic passengers began to wonder if they would make it to Cheyenne. In the cockpit, Marcus was fully absorbed in his task, his hands making minute adjustments to the throttle in a rhythm that seemed almost musical. The engine readings began to show subtle changes, the wild oscillations in the vibration data becoming more regular, then gradually diminishing. It's working, Dr. Chen breathed, watching the numbers stabilize. The resonance is breaking down. Peter, despite his earlier objections, was now fully engaged in supporting Marcus, calling out readings with precision. Vibration down 18%, temperature stabilizing. Marcus nodded but didn't break his concentration. Now comes the tricky part. We need to gradually reduce power while maintaining the counter-frequency. For the next 3 minutes, the cockpit was silent except for the exchange of technical data as Marcus performed a shutdown procedure that existed in no training manual but was executed with the precision of a concert pianist. Finally, the right engine spooled down to a safe idle state, its threatening roar reduced to a gentle hum. Right engine stabilized, Marcus announced, preparing for single-engine approach to Cheyenne. The relief in the cockpit was palpable, but they weren't safe yet. Landing a commercial airliner with a compromised engine was still a significant challenge. Marcus keyed the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Johnson. We have successfully addressed the engine issue and are now on approach to Cheyenne Regional Airport. We'll be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. Please continue to follow all crew instructions. His calm, authoritative voice helped soothe the cabin, though tension remained high. As they began their final approach, Marcus glanced briefly at Dr. Chen. "Thank you for your assistance. Having you verify my approach gave me the confidence to proceed." Sarah nodded. "I'm just amazed you knew about that research paper. Most pilots I've met barely understand the basic principles of the engines they operate." "I'm not most pilots," Marcus said simply, returning his attention to the landing. Peter, overhearing this exchange, felt a twinge of shame for his initial doubts. "Captain, for what it's worth, that was the most impressive piece of airmanship I've ever witnessed." Marcus acknowledged the compliment with a nod, but his focus remained on the challenging landing ahead. They were still far from safe, and every ounce of his experience and skill would be needed to get them on the ground without incident. As the lights of Cheyenne came into view through the clouds, the true test of Captain Marcus Johnson's abilities was about to begin. And in the cabin, 157 passengers held their breath, their lives in the hands of a man some of them had doubted based solely on the color of his skin. The approach to Cheyenne Regional Airport was anything but routine. Flying with one engine at reduced power meant that Marcus had to constantly adjust for the asymmetrical thrust pushing the aircraft to one side. Each adjustment required precise calculation and execution. Too much correction and they'd overcompensate, too little and they'd drift off course. In the cabin, the flight attendants had completed their emergency briefing. "Brace positions," Sofia Rodriguez demonstrated, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Head down, hands over your head. When we stop, leave everything behind and move quickly to the nearest exit." Passengers assumed the position, some whispering prayers, others clutching loved ones' hands. In row 15, the debate team coach, Ms. Abernathy, looked over her students with fierce protectiveness. "Remember," she told them quietly, "when we land, we move as a group. Nobody gets left behind." Deshaun Morris, the aspiring pilot, sat up straighter. "Ms. Abernathy, listen to the engine. It's smoother now. The captain fixed something major." She listened, realizing he was right. The terrifying shudder had subsided, replaced by a more consistent, if still concerning, vibration. "How do you know that, Deshaun?" "I've been studying aircraft systems since I was 10, he replied. "That sound before it was all wrong. Now it's just an engine running at low power. We've got a chance." His technical understanding, so reminiscent of Captain Johnson's expertise, gave Ms. Abernathy a surge of hope. These young black men with their passion for flight, their meticulous knowledge, they deserved a world that recognized their brilliance without qualification. In first class, Richard Whitfield had fallen into a sullen silence, his phone ruined, his predictions of doom increasingly contradicted by the stabilizing flight. Ruth Goldstein, the elderly woman beside him, patted his arm with surprising gentleness. "It's okay to be afraid," she told him. "What's not okay is letting fear turn into hatred." Whitfield didn't respond, but the tight line of his jaw suggested her words had landed. In the cockpit, Marcus, Peter, and Dr. Chen worked in practice coordination despite having never flown together before. This kind of seamless teamwork usually took months to develop, but crisis had accelerated their bonding. "Flaps 30, Marcus ordered as they descended through 1,000 feet. "Flaps 30, Peter confirmed, making the adjustment. "Landing gear down," Marcus continued. "Landing gear down and locked," Peter verified as 3 green indicator lights illuminated. Dr. Chen monitored the compromised engine, ready to alert them to any changes. "Engine parameters holding steady. You've successfully broken the resonance pattern." "Cheyenne Tower, Trans-American 2276 final approach, runway 27, Marcus reported. "Trans-American 2276, Cheyenne Tower, cleared to land runway 27. Wind 290 at 12 knots. Emergency vehicles in position," Marcus acknowledged, then spoke to his team. "This landing will be faster than normal due to our configuration. We'll need to use maximum braking. Peter, be ready on the thrust reversers for the good engine." "Understood, Captain." The runway lights appeared through the darkness, a welcoming strip of civilization in the vast Wyoming night. Marcus made final adjustments, compensating for the crosswind while managing the asymmetrical thrust. 500, the automated altitude callout announced. Marcus felt a familiar calm settle over him, the focus that had gotten him through countless challenging situations in his career. All external concerns fell away. There was only the aircraft, the physics, and the razor's edge of control he maintained between them. 400, 300, 200. In these critical moments, no one cared about the color of his skin or the obstacles he'd overcome to sit in this seat. All that mattered was his skill, his ability to bring this wounded aircraft safely to Earth. 100, 50, 40, 30. Marcus flared the aircraft perfectly, transitioning from descent to the shallow angle needed for touchdown. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and they'd float down the runway, potentially running out of space. Too late and they'd hit too hard, risking structural damage. 20, 10. The main landing gear touched down with a firm but controlled impact. Immediately, Marcus called reverse thrust as he applied maximum braking. Peter deployed the thrust reverser on the functioning engine, creating an additional deceleration force, but also another asymmetrical challenge that Marcus had to counteract. The aircraft shuddered as it slowed, the forces at play creating vibrations throughout the fuselage. In the cabin, passengers remained in their brace positions, the rapid deceleration pressing them against their seatbelts. As they passed the runway midpoint, still traveling at over 100 knots, a new alarm sounded in the cockpit. "Brake temperature high on right main gear," Peter reported tensely. Marcus nodded but maintained pressure. They needed every foot of deceleration they could get. "Keep monitoring. Release pressure if we approach critical values." Dr. Chen leaned forward. "The right gear is taking more stress due to the weight distribution from the compromised engine." "Acknowledged," Marcus said, already compensating by adjusting the differential braking. The runway end was approaching, the bright red lights of the overrun area growing larger in the windscreen. For a moment, it seemed they might not stop in time. 80 knots, 70, 60. The deceleration was working, but would it be enough? The flight crew watched intently as the runway remaining shortened with each passing second. 50, 40, 30 knots. With less than 1,000 feet of runway remaining, the aircraft finally slowed to taxi speed. Marcus gently applied right rudder to steer them onto a taxiway, safely clear of the runway. "Trans-American 2276, clear of active runway," he reported to the tower, his voice betraying none of the tension of the past few minutes. "Trans-American 2276, taxi to emergency stand via taxiway Charlie. Emergency vehicles will follow." "Roger, taxiing to emergency stand." As the immediate danger passed, Peter let out a long breath. "That was, I don't even have words, Captain, incredible airmanship." Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. "I've worked with test pilots at NASA for years. What you just did ranks among the most impressive flying I've ever witnessed." Marcus allowed himself a small smile, the first since the crisis began. "Thank you both. We're not done yet, though. Let's get these passengers safely disembarked." He keyed the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Johnson. We are safely on the ground in Cheyenne. Please remain seated until we reach our parking position. Then, as a precaution, we'll be using the emergency slides for disembarkation. The flight attendants will provide instructions." Throughout the cabin, tension gave way to relief. Applause broke out spontaneously, passengers clapping and cheering for the crew that had brought them safely to Earth. Some were crying, others laughing with the giddy release of extreme stress. Sofia Rodriguez moved through the cabin, checking on passengers and preparing for evacuation. When she passed row 15, Deshaun Morris stopped her. "Excuse me, ma'am, could you tell Captain Johnson something for me?" "Of course," Sophia replied, touched by the earnestness in the young man's face. "Tell him he's the reason I want to be a pilot, and today just proved I made the right choice." Sophia smiled. "I'll make sure he knows." As the aircraft came to its final stop at the emergency stand, Marcus completed the shutdown checklist, his movements as precise in conclusion as they had been throughout the crisis. "Engines off, APU running, parking brake set," he confirmed. "Prepare for evacuation." Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their lights painting the night in flashes of red and white. Inside, passengers prepared to exit via the emergency slides, following the crew's instructions with newfound respect and compliance. As Marcus turned to leave the cockpit, Peter stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Captain, I need to apologize. When you proposed that unconventional solution, I doubted you." Marcus met his gaze directly. "We're trained to follow procedures, Peter." Questioning a deviation is exactly what a good first officer should do. "But it wasn't just professional caution," Peter admitted. "For a split second, I wondered if part of my hesitation was because I'm black." Marcus finished for him, his voice matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Peter nodded, uncomfortable but determined to be honest. "Maybe unconsciously, and I'm ashamed of that." Marcus considered this. "We all have biases, Peter. The question is whether we let them override our better judgment. You didn't. When it counted, you supported me based on the evidence at hand." "Still," Peter insisted. You shouldn't have to be extraordinary just to be taken seriously. No, Marcus agreed. I shouldn't, but until the world changes, I'll keep being extraordinary anyway. He smiled slightly. Now let's get our passengers off this aircraft. As they prepared to evacuate, none of them could have predicted how the events of this night would ripple outward, changing not just their own lives, but the perceptions and prejudices of everyone who had been on Trans-American Flight 2276. For now, though, they had done something remarkable. They had saved 157 lives through expertise, teamwork, and courage. And in doing so, they had demonstrated that excellence knows no color, that competence deserves respect regardless of race, and that sometimes the people we underestimate are precisely the ones we should trust the most. The evacuation proceeded with practiced efficiency. Flight attendants stationed themselves at each exit, directing passengers to remove shoes and leave belongings behind before sliding down to the tarmac where emergency personnel waited to assist them. Arms crossed, legs together. Jump and slide, Sofia Rodriguez called out as she helped passengers exit through the forward door. Despite the late hour and the stress of the emergency landing, the evacuation was orderly. The debate team moved as a coordinated unit, just as Ms. Abernathy had instructed, with older students helping younger ones down the slides. In first class, Ruth Goldstein hesitated at the exit, looking apprehensively at the steep slide. At 78, she wasn't confident in her ability to navigate it without injury. "I'll go with you," a voice said beside her. It was Richard Whitfield, the businessman who had been so vocal in his criticism earlier. "We'll go together, and I'll make sure you don't get hurt." Ruth looked at him with surprise, then nodded gratefully. "Thank you, young man." They went down together, Whitfield's arm protectively around the elderly woman, his earlier arrogance seemingly washed away by the sobering reality of their near disaster. On the tarmac, passengers were directed to buses that would take them to the terminal. Medical personnel checked those who appeared shaken or injured, while airport staff distributed water and blankets against the Wyoming night chill. Marcus was the last to leave the aircraft, following protocol that dictated the captain be the final person off in an evacuation. As he emerged from the plane, he saw the full scale of the emergency response: fire trucks, ambulances, police vehicles, their lights creating a kaleidoscope against the dark sky. Airport officials approached him immediately. "Captain Johnson, I'm Howard Reeves, Cheyenne Regional Airport Director. Remarkable job getting this aircraft down safely." Marcus nodded, the adrenaline of the crisis finally beginning to ebb, leaving him feeling the full weight of the past hour's stress. "Thank you. Has everyone been evacuated safely?" "Yes, all passengers accounted for. Minor injuries, only a few scrapes and sprains from the evacuation slides. Given what could have happened, it's nothing short of miraculous." "Not miraculous," Dr. Chen interjected, having overheard as she approached. "It was skill and knowledge." Captain Johnson executed a maneuver that most pilots wouldn't even know existed. Reeves looked between them, curious. "I'll want a full briefing for our report, but that can wait until you've had some rest. For now, there's quite a crowd waiting to thank you in the terminal." As they walked toward the buses that would take them to the building, Peter fell into step beside Marcus. "They're already calling it the miracle in Cheyenne on social media," he said, showing Marcus his phone. "Someone filmed the landing from the terminal and posted it online. It's going viral." Marcus glanced at the video shaky footage showing their aircraft touching down with one engine clearly not functioning normally, then the tense moments as they decelerated down the runway. "Miracle implies divine intervention," he said. "This was teamwork and training. And your unconventional knowledge of engine harmonics," Peter added. "Which, by the way, you never explained how you came to have." Marcus was quiet for a moment as they boarded the bus. "My father," he finally said. "He wasn't just an Air Force mechanic. He was considered one of the best turbine specialists in the service. He couldn't become a pilot because of the color of his skin, so he channeled his passion for flight into understanding engines at a level few others did." He looked out the window at the aircraft they'd just left, still intact, still repairable, still holding the lives it had been entrusted with. "He taught me that if I wanted to survive as a black pilot, I couldn't just be as good as everyone else. I had to know more, understand deeper, work harder. So I did." The bus pulled away, heading toward the terminal building where, unknown to Marcus, a scene was unfolding that would change the trajectory of his life and career. Inside the terminal, passengers from Flight 2276 had gathered in the main waiting area. Initial shock had given way to a complex mixture of emotions: relief at being alive, gratitude toward the crew, and for many, a dawning recognition of their own biases. Richard Whitfield sat quietly in a corner, his earlier bluster gone. Ruth Goldstein sat beside him, her hand occasionally patting his arm in grandmotherly reassurance. "I behaved abominably," he admitted to her. "The things I said about the captain." "Fear makes monsters of us all sometimes," Ruth replied. "The question is whether we learn from it." Across the room, Deshaun Morris was energetically explaining the technical aspects of what had happened to his fellow debate team members. "It wasn't just good flying," he insisted. "The captain actually fixed the engine in flight. That's beyond anything they teach in standard training." Ms. Abernathy watched him with pride. In the midst of crisis, her student had found inspiration rather than fear. Evelyn Washington, the woman who had confronted Whitfield about his comments regarding black pilots, was speaking with several other passengers. "My son faces this kind of prejudice every day in his career," she was saying. "People see him in uniform and still ask if there's a pilot on board." "I've been guilty of that," an older man admitted. "Not saying it out loud maybe, but thinking it. After today, I won't make that mistake again." As these conversations continued, the terminal doors opened, and the flight crew entered. A spontaneous round of applause broke out, growing in intensity as passengers rose to their feet in recognition of the people who had saved their lives. Marcus paused, momentarily overwhelmed by the response. Throughout his career, he had experienced everything from subtle doubts to outright hostility based on his race. This unambiguous appreciation was something new. Sofia Rodriguez, seeing his hesitation, gently nudged him forward. "They're applauding for you, Captain. You deserve it." As Marcus moved into the room, passengers approached him. Some wanted to shake his hand, others simply to say thank you. Children looked up at him with awe, parents with gratitude. The debate team surrounded him, Deshaun at the front. "Captain Johnson," the young man said, his voice steady despite his obvious excitement. "I've followed your career since I read about you in Modern Aviation. I want to be a pilot too. What you did today, it confirms everything I believed about you." Marcus looked at the young man, seeing a reflection of his younger self, the same passion, the same determination to succeed in a field where faces like theirs were still too rare. "What's your name?" "Deshaun Morris, sir. Lincoln Preparatory Academy, Chicago." "My hometown," Marcus smiled. "Well, Deshaun, if you're serious about flying, I'd be happy to mentor you." "The industry needs more young people with your enthusiasm." Deshaun's eyes widened. "Really? That would be amazing." As they spoke, a man approached hesitantly. It was Richard Whitfield, looking decidedly less confident than he had on the aircraft. "Captain Johnson," he began, his voice low, "I need to apologize. The things I said during the flight, they were inexcusable." Marcus studied him, seeing not just embarrassment but genuine regret. "Fear makes people say things they don't mean." "No," Whitfield shook his head firmly. "Fear might have made me panic, but those thoughts were already there. I've carried assumptions I didn't even realize I had until they came spilling out when I thought we were going to die." He extended his hand. "Thank you for saving my life despite my behavior." Marcus accepted the handshake, recognizing the courage it took for the man to acknowledge his prejudice so openly. "We all have room to grow, Mr. Whitfield. The important thing is that we try." As the impromptu receiving line continued, airport officials and airline representatives moved through the crowd, organizing hotel accommodations for the night and rebooking options for the following day. Dr. Chen approached Marcus as the crowd began to disperse. "Captain, we need to document what happened with that engine. The harmonic resonance issue is still theoretical in most circles. Your experience today could prevent future incidents." Marcus nodded. "I'll make sure it's all in my report." "And Dr. Chen, thank you for your assistance. Having an expert confirm my diagnosis gave me the confidence to proceed." "You didn't need my confirmation," she replied frankly. "You knew exactly what was happening and how to address it. I just provided moral support." "Sometimes that's the most important kind of support," Marcus said. As the night progressed, passengers were gradually transferred to nearby hotels. The flight crew, after completing preliminary reports, were given rooms where they could rest before the more detailed debriefings that would follow in the morning. In his hotel room, Marcus finally allowed himself to fully process the events of the day. He called his wife, Lisa, who had already seen the news reports. "They're calling you a hero," she told him, her voice thick with emotion. "They're saying no one else could have landed that plane safely." "That's an exaggeration," Marcus replied. "Any well-trained pilot could have gotten us down. The engine issue was the unusual part." "And that's exactly where your extra knowledge made the difference," Lisa insisted. "All those nights studying engineering texts, all those weekends at the simulator when you could have been home. This is why you did it all." Marcus smiled, remembering how Lisa had supported his seemingly excessive dedication to understanding aircraft systems far beyond what was required for his pilot's license. "I just did my job, honey." "You did more than your job," she countered, "and from what I'm seeing online, people are finally recognizing it." After they hung up, Marcus checked the news on his phone. The story was indeed spreading rapidly. "Black pilot's extraordinary skill saves 157 lives," read one headline. "Captain's unconventional knowledge prevents disaster," proclaimed another. There were already requests for interviews, statements from the airline praising his actions, and social media buzzing with accounts from passengers. Many specifically mentioned their newfound awareness of bias, sharing how their preconceptions had been challenged by witnessing Marcus's expertise in action. As he prepared for bed, exhausted but unable to fully relax, Marcus reflected on his father's words from decades ago. "They'll doubt you because of how you look, so no more than they do. Be better than they expect, not because you should have to be, but because that's how change happens." Tomorrow would bring scrutiny investigations into his decision to deviate from standard procedures, questions about his unconventional approach to the engine failure. But tonight, in a hotel room in Wyoming, Captain Marcus Johnson allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had lived up to his father's legacy. He had saved his passengers. And perhaps, in some small way, he had moved the needle of perception for black pilots everywhere. As he drifted toward sleep, his last conscious thought was of young Deshaun Morris and the spark of possibility he had seen in the boy's eyes, the same spark his father had nurtured in him, now passing to a new generation. The morning after the emergency landing brought clear skies and a flurry of activity. News crews had descended on Cheyenne Regional Airport, setting up cameras and conducting interviews with passengers as they gathered in the terminal lobby. Marcus arrived early for his debriefing, having slept fitfully despite his exhaustion. In the airport's administrative offices, he found a team assembled to review the incident. Representatives from the FAA, the NTSB, the Airline's Safety Division, and the aircraft manufacturer. "Captain Johnson," greeted FAA investigator Thomas Hargrove, "we've got quite a situation to unpack here. Your actions yesterday don't align with any standard emergency procedure for engine failure." Marcus nodded, fully prepared for this line of questioning. "That's correct. The situation we encountered was not a standard engine failure. It was a specific harmonic resonance issue affecting the gearbox of the PW1000G engine, a theoretical failure mode that's been documented in engineering literature, but had never been encountered in commercial flight." Dr. Chen, who had been asked to join the meeting, nodded in confirmation. "Captain Johnson correctly identified a phenomenon that most aviation professionals aren't even aware exists. The standard procedure would have exacerbated the problem, potentially leading to catastrophic failure." The investigators exchanged glances. Hargrove leaned forward. "And how exactly did you come to know about this theoretical failure mode, Captain?" "Professional interest," Marcus replied. "My father was an Air Force turbine specialist. I grew up around engines and developed a passion for understanding them at a fundamental level. I've read extensively on propulsion systems, corresponded with engineers in the field, and spent time in simulators testing various failure scenarios. None of which is required for your position," noted the airline safety representative, a woman named Janet Phillips. "No," Marcus acknowledged, "but it proved valuable yesterday." The questioning continued for hours, exhaustive in its detail. Marcus walked them through each decision, each adjustment, explaining his reasoning with the clarity and precision that characterized his flying. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data had already confirmed his account, but the investigators needed to understand the thought process behind his unconventional actions. By early afternoon, the mood in the room had shifted from skepticism to something approaching admiration. "I've been investigating incidents for 22 years, Hargrove finally said, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. You essentially performed a maintenance procedure from the cockpit while flying a compromised aircraft. A procedure that isn't in any manual," added Janet Phillips, "but one that saved the aircraft and everyone on board." The NTSB representative, a serious man named Richardson, nodded in agreement. "Our preliminary assessment is that Captain Johnson's actions prevented what would likely have been a catastrophic failure. We'll be recommending that the manufacturer and airlines incorporate awareness of this harmonic resonance issue into their training programs." As the meeting concluded, Hargrove pulled Marcus aside. Off the record, Captain, that was one hell of a piece of airmanship. The industry will be studying this case for years. Marcus thanked him, relieved that the official response was positive but still processing the entirety of the experience. Outside the meeting room, he found Peter and the rest of the flight crew waiting. "How did it go?" Peter asked anxiously. "About as well as could be expected," Marcus replied. "They're satisfied that my actions were appropriate given the circumstances." "More than appropriate," Dr. Chen interjected, having exited behind him. "They're talking about updating training protocols based on this incident. Your knowledge may end up saving more lives in the future." As they made their way to the terminal, where passengers were preparing to board replacement flights to their destinations, Marcus was struck by how different the atmosphere felt from the previous day. Where there had been terror and doubt, there was now a sense of community and shared experience. The debate team spotted him first, waving enthusiastically. Ms. Abernathy approached, extending her hand. "Captain Johnson, we wanted to thank you properly before we left. What you did yesterday wasn't just impressive flying, it was a powerful lesson for these students about excellence and perseverance." "It was my pleasure," Marcus replied, genuinely moved by her words. "And I meant what I said to Deshan about mentoring. The industry needs diverse perspectives and talents." "He hasn't stopped talking about it," Ms. Abernathy smiled. "You've given him a direction for all that intellect and energy." Across the terminal, Richard Whitfield was watching this interaction. After a moment's hesitation, he approached, carrying a business card. "Captain Johnson, I meant what I said last night about my behavior. I'd like to make amends in a more concrete way." He handed Marcus the card. "I'm on the board of a foundation that provides scholarships to underprivileged youth. After meeting that young man from the debate team and seeing his passion for aviation, I'd like to establish a scholarship specifically for black students interested in becoming pilots. Would you consider being an advisor for the program?" Marcus took the card, surprised by the gesture. "That's generous, Mr. Whitfield. I'd be happy to discuss it further." "It's the least I can do," Whitfield replied. "Yesterday was a wake-up call in more ways than one." As passengers began boarding their various flights, many stopped to thank Marcus and the crew again. Sofia Rodriguez stood beside him, observing the procession of gratitude with a smile. "You know what's different about this," she said quietly. "They're seeing you, not just a uniform, not a stereotype, but you, your skill, your knowledge, your humanity." Marcus considered this. Throughout his career, he had often felt invisible as a person while simultaneously hypervisible as a black pilot, scrutinized, questioned, doubted. This recognition of his individual excellence rather than his representative status felt like a subtle but significant shift. As the terminal gradually emptied, airline officials approached with news. A corporate jet was being sent to transport the crew back to Chicago. The airline's CEO wanted to meet with them personally. During the flight home, Marcus found himself seated next to Dr. Chen. "What will you do now?" he asked her. "Return to NASA?" "Eventually," she nodded. "But first, I'm going to write a comprehensive paper on what happened yesterday. The aviation community needs to know about this failure mode and your solution." "I'd be happy to contribute," Marcus offered. "Actually," Dr. Chen replied, "I was hoping you might consider co-authoring it. Your practical experience combined with my theoretical background would make a compelling case for updating industry standards." Marcus agreed, seeing an opportunity to potentially influence aviation safety on a broader scale than his individual flights. When they landed in Chicago, the media presence was substantial. Cameras flashed and reporters called questions as they deplaned. The airline had arranged a brief press conference, recognizing the public interest in the story. Standing at the podium, Marcus spoke briefly about the incident, crediting his team and the passengers for their cooperation during the emergency. When questions turned personal about being a black pilot in a predominantly white industry, he answered with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Aviation, like many fields, has historically had barriers to entry for people of color," he acknowledged. "Those barriers are lower now than when my father wanted to fly, but they still exist in subtle ways. What I hope people take from this incident is that expertise and excellence come in all colors. The air currents don't care about race, and neither should we when evaluating who belongs in a cockpit." After the press conference, he was finally able to return home where Lisa was waiting. Their embrace was long and silent, both of them processing how close they had come to losing each other. "The phone's been ringing nonstop," she told him as they entered their modest suburban home. "News outlets, talk shows, publishing agents. Someone even mentioned a movie possibility." Marcus shook his head, overwhelmed. "All I did was my job." "No," Lisa countered, taking his face in her hands. All you did was be exactly who you've always been, exceptionally good at what you do. The difference is that now everyone else sees it too. Over the following weeks, the story of Trans-American Flight 2276 remained in the public consciousness. The technical aspects fascinated aviation enthusiasts, while the human elements, particularly the confrontation of racial bias, resonated with a broader audience. Marcus found himself reluctantly in the spotlight, carefully balancing media appearances with his continuing duties as a pilot. He was selective about which platforms he engaged with, prioritizing those that allowed him to discuss aviation safety and diversity in the industry rather than just his personal heroics. The paper he co-authored with Dr. Chen received immediate attention from aircraft manufacturers and airlines, prompting a review of training protocols for the PW1000G engine. His recommendation to include more detailed engineering principles in pilot training was adopted by several major carriers. Perhaps most significantly, Marcus established a formal mentorship program for young people of color interested in aviation careers, with Deshaun Morris as one of the first participants. Richard Whitfield, true to his word, provided substantial funding for scholarships. 6 months after the incident, Marcus was invited to speak at a national aviation safety conference. As he looked out at the audience, a sea of industry professionals who now regarded him with unquestioning respect, he thought again of his father's words about how change happens. Safety in aviation doesn't come from doing the minimum, he told them. It comes from understanding the why behind the procedures, from curiosity that goes beyond checklists, from knowledge that transcends basic requirements. And diversity in aviation isn't just about demographics, it's about diverse perspectives, experiences, and approaches to problem-solving that make us all safer in the air. The applause was thunderous, but it was the nodding heads and thoughtful expressions that told Marcus his message was truly being received. Later that evening, at a reception following his speech, an older white pilot approached him. "Captain Johnson, I've been flying for 37 years. What you did on that flight to Cheyenne, I'm not sure I could have done it. I just wanted to say that." "Thank you," Marcus replied. "That means a lot coming from someone with your experience." The man hesitated, then continued. "I also want to apologize. Years ago, when pilots like you first started entering the industry in larger numbers, I was one of those who wondered if standards were being lowered. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for that." Marcus nodded, recognizing the courage it took to make such an admission. "We all have biases to overcome. The important thing is that we keep working on them." As he drove home that night, Marcus reflected on how a single hour of crisis had rippled outward, changing not just his life, but potentially the entire industry's approach to both technical training and diversity. The incident had forced people to confront their biases in a way that abstract discussions never could. When your life is in someone's hands, their competence suddenly matters far more than their color. Arriving home, he found Deshaun and 2 other mentees waiting in his living room. Lisa had invited them over for an informal session while Marcus was at the conference. "Sorry I'm late," he told them, setting down his briefcase. "How's everyone doing with their flight hour logging?" As they eagerly shared their progress, Marcus felt a profound sense of purpose. The near disaster of Flight 2276 had transformed into something positive, a catalyst for change, a platform for influence, an opportunity to hold doors open for those coming behind him. In the years that followed, Marcus Johnson would become known not just for that one remarkable feat of airmanship, but for his lasting impact on aviation safety and diversity. The industry would slowly shift, becoming more inclusive not through mandates or quotas, but through the undeniable evidence that excellence knows no color. And somewhere in the skies above America, on any given day, pilots trained under his influence would be flying with deeper knowledge, broader perspectives, and fewer biases, making the air safer for everyone while proving that the best person for any job is simply the one who does it best. 10 years after the events of Trans-American Flight 2276, a new generation of pilots was entering the aviation industry. Among them was Captain Deshaun Morris, now 26 years old and recently promoted to the left seat at a major airline. The landscape of commercial aviation had changed significantly in the decade since Marcus Johnson's remarkable landing in Cheyenne. The Johnson Protocol, as it had come to be known, was now standard training for pilots operating aircraft with geared turbofan engines. Engineering principles once considered too technical for cockpit crews were routinely included in training programs, creating pilots with deeper understanding of the complex systems they operated. More visible, however, was the change in who occupied those cockpits. The percentage of black pilots had doubled, still below proportional representation but moving steadily in the right direction. Women in the flight deck had increased by nearly 60%. The industry was slowly transforming, not through lowered standards as some had feared, but through expanded opportunity and recognition of talent in all its forms. On this particular morning, Deshan was preparing for his first flight as captain on a Chicago to San Francisco route. As he completed his pre-flight checks, his first officer, Amanda Rodriguez, organized her materials in the right seat. "Nervous?" she asked, noticing his careful attention to each item on the checklist. "A little," Deshan admitted. "First flight as captain, I want everything perfect." Amanda nodded understandingly. "I've heard that never really goes away. My mother says she still feels it after 20 years of flying." "Your mother is a pilot too?" Deshan asked, looking up with interest. "Chief flight attendant," Amanda corrected with a smile. "Sophia Rodriguez, she was on that famous flight with Captain Johnson, the one that changed everything." Deshan's eyes widened. "Your mother is Sophia Rodriguez. She was there when Captain Johnson saved Flight 2276. That's incredible. That flight is the reason I became a pilot." "I know," Amanda replied. "Mom kept all the news clippings. When I told her I'd be flying with you, she remembered you were the debate team student who wanted to be a pilot. Small world, isn't it?" Before Deshan could respond, there was a knock at the cockpit door. A flight attendant poked her head in. "Captain, there's a passenger who specifically asked to meet you before boarding. He says he's an old friend." Curious, Deshan stepped out of the cockpit into the jet bridge. There, waiting with a warm smile, was Marcus Johnson, now in his mid-50s, with touches of gray at his temples but still carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had impressed a 16-year-old Deshan a decade earlier. "Captain Morris," Marcus greeted him, extending his hand. "Congratulations on your promotion." "Captain Johnson?" Deshan exclaimed, shaking his hand enthusiastically. "I had no idea you'd be on this flight." "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied. "Your first flight as captain? This is a day worth celebrating." They spoke briefly in the jet bridge, Marcus asking about Deshan's preparations and offering a few last words of advice. Before returning to the cockpit, Deshan said, "You know, I was just telling my first officer about Flight 2276. It's still hard to believe that one incident changed so much." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "It wasn't just the incident. It was what people chose to do with it afterward. The passengers who confronted their biases, the airline that embraced new training standards, the industry that opened itself to new perspectives, and young people like you who seized the opportunities that created." As Deshan returned to the cockpit to continue his preparations, he found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had led him to this moment. One flight, one crisis, one example of extraordinary competence had helped reshape an industry and create a path for him to follow. When it came time for the pre-flight announcements, Deshan keyed the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Deshan Morris welcoming you aboard Transamerican Flight 843 to San Francisco. The weather looks good all the way, and we should have a smooth flight today." He paused, then added, "I'd also like to acknowledge a special passenger with us today, Captain Marcus Johnson, whose example of excellence and dedication inspired not just my career, but an entire generation of pilots. We're honored to have him aboard." In the cabin, passengers who recognized the name applauded. Many didn't know the full story, but over the years, Captain Johnson had become synonymous with exceptional skill and the breaking of barriers in commercial aviation. Marcus, seated in 12A, acknowledged the recognition with a modest nod. He hadn't sought fame from the incident, but he had embraced the platform it gave him to effect change. Now, watching the next generation take the controls, he felt the satisfaction of seeing seeds planted long ago bearing fruit. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Marcus gazed out the window at the busy airport operations. So much had changed, yet the fundamentals remained the same: the physics of flight, the precision required for safety, the trust passengers placed in those at the controls. What had shifted was something less tangible but equally important: the recognition that excellence comes in all forms, that assumptions based on appearance have no place in evaluating competence, and that often the people we underestimate are precisely the ones who will rise to extraordinary heights when given the chance. The engines spooled up, and the aircraft began to taxi. In the cockpit, Captain Deshaun Morris guided the controls with the confidence and precision he had learned from his mentor. And in seat 12A, Marcus Johnson settled in for the flight, content in the knowledge that his legacy would continue long after he made his final landing. As the aircraft lifted into the clear blue sky, it carried not just passengers and cargo, but a living example of how one person's excellence can change perceptions, open doors, and ultimately transform an entire industry for the better. The story of Flight 2276 had evolved from a near disaster to a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful way to combat prejudice is simply to be so good that it cannot be denied. And in that transformation lay a lesson for everyone who heard the story, that excellence knows no color, that competence deserves respect regardless of race, and that when we look past our biases to recognize true skill, we all rise higher together. 5 years later, on the 15th anniversary of Flight 2276, a special ceremony was held at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. A new exhibit was being unveiled, Breaking Barriers, Diversity in American Aviation, and at its center was the reconstructed cockpit from the very aircraft Captain Marcus Johnson had landed in Cheyenne. The museum was filled with aviation professionals, industry leaders, and many of the passengers who had been on that momentous flight. Deshaun Morris, now a veteran captain with a reputation for excellence in his own right, stood beside his mentor as they prepared to cut the ribbon on the exhibit. "It feels surreal," Deshaun admitted quietly. "Seeing it all preserved like this, knowing people will be learning from it for generations." Marcus nodded, surveying the gathered crowd. He spotted familiar faces: Peter Reynolds, now a chief pilot trainer; Dr. Sarah Chen, whose research on engine harmonics had revolutionized aspects of aircraft design; Sofia Rodriguez, recently retired after a distinguished career; and even Richard Whitfield, whose foundation had now helped over 300 young people of color pursue aviation careers. Most touching, however, was the presence of James Johnson, Marcus's father, now in his 80s, seated in a wheelchair in the front row. The man who had been denied the chance to fly, but had passed his passion to his son, looked up with undisguised pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," the museum director began, "today we commemorate not just an extraordinary feat of airmanship, but a turning point in the history of American aviation. 15 years ago, Captain Marcus Johnson's unprecedented handling of a critical emergency not only saved 157 lives, but challenged deep-seated assumptions about who belongs in a cockpit." She gestured to the exhibit behind her. "This installation tells that story, not just of one flight, but of how it sparked a transformation in our industry. Since that day, the percentage of pilots from underrepresented groups has tripled. Engineering principles once considered beyond the scope of pilot training are now standard curriculum. And most importantly, countless young people have seen that excellence knows no boundaries of race, gender, or background." As Marcus was invited to speak, he approached the podium with the same quiet confidence that had characterized his entire career. Looking out at the assembled crowd, at his father, his former passengers, his mentees, and the industry leaders who had once doubted people who looked like him, he felt the weight of the moment. 15 years ago, he began, "I was simply doing my job to the best of my ability. I didn't set out to make history or change an industry. I just wanted to bring my passengers home safely." He paused, surveying the faces before him. But what happened afterward, that was remarkable. People confronted their biases. Institutions questioned their assumptions. Doors opened that had long been closed, and a new generation of aviators saw possibilities they might never have imagined. Marcus gestured to Deshaun and several other pilots he had mentored over the years. "These exceptional professionals aren't here because standards were lowered. They're here because artificial barriers were removed, allowing true merit to be recognized. And our skies are safer because of the diverse perspectives, experiences, and talents they bring to the cockpit." He turned to acknowledge his father. "My father couldn't become a pilot because of the color of his skin, but he taught me something invaluable, that knowledge is the ultimate equalizer. That if you understand something deeply enough, thoroughly enough, no one can deny your competence." As he concluded his remarks, Marcus reflected on the journey from that tense cockpit in Wyoming to this moment of recognition. The story of Flight 2276 had transcended the usual narrative of heroism to become something more profound, a catalyst for examining how prejudice limits potential, not just for individuals but for entire industries and societies. After the ceremony, as guests explored the exhibit, Richard Whitfield approached Marcus with an elderly Ruth Goldstein beside him. Though now in her 90s, Ruth's eyes still sparkled with the same spirit she had shown on the flight. "Captain Johnson," she greeted him warmly, "I always knew I'd live long enough to see this day. Stubbornness is a virtue sometimes." Marcus smiled, genuinely pleased to see her again. "It certainly is, Mrs. Goldstein." Richard, who had transformed from critic to ally over the years, shook Marcus's hand. "The foundation just approved our 500th scholarship," he said proudly. "Next year's class is the largest yet." "That's wonderful news," Marcus replied. "Those students will transform the industry even further." As they moved through the exhibit, Marcus found himself beside his father's wheelchair, both of them staring at the reconstructed cockpit. The scene of crisis turned into a monument to change. "You did it, son," James Johnson said softly, reaching up to grasp his son's hand. "You flew higher than I ever could have imagined." Marcus squeezed his father's hand, emotion tightening his throat. "I flew on your knowledge, Dad, on your dreams. Everything I accomplished started with what you taught me." Later that evening, as the formal events concluded, a small group gathered in a private room at the museum. The original crew of Flight 2276, key passengers, and some of the pilots Marcus had mentored over the years. It wasn't an official part of the program, just a moment for those who had been directly touched by the events to reconnect. Sofia Rodriguez raised a glass. "To Flight 2276, the flight that never made it to Denver but ended up going so much further." As conversations flowed around him, Marcus found himself beside Dr. Chen, who is now a leading figure in aviation engineering. "Our paper has been cited over 1,000 times," she noted with satisfaction. "The Johnson-Chen protocol is standard in every manual now." "Still feels strange to have my name in the textbooks," Marcus admitted. "Get used to it," she replied with a smile. "You'll be in aviation history books forever now." As the evening wound down, Desson approached with a group of younger pilots, men and women of various backgrounds, all of whom had benefited from the changes catalyzed by Flight 2276. "We wanted to thank you," a young woman said to Marcus. "Not just for the mentorship or the foundation, but for showing us what's possible." "You've done the hard part yourselves," Marcus told them. "All I did was help people see what should have been obvious all along, that excellence is the only qualification that truly matters." As he looked at their faces, confident, capable, the future of aviation, Marcus felt the completion of a circle that had begun with his father's thwarted dreams. The barriers hadn't been completely dismantled, but they had been significantly weakened. The flight deck was finally beginning to reflect the diversity of the passengers it served. 15 years after a crisis that could have ended in tragedy, the true legacy of Flight 2276 wasn't just a successful emergency landing or even a celebrated pilot. It was a fundamental shift in perception. A recognition that when lives are at stake, what matters isn't the color of the hands on the controls, but the knowledge, skill, and judgment they possess. And in that recognition lay hope not just for aviation, but for all fields where artificial barriers had limited human potential. The lesson of Flight 2276 transcended the cockpit. When we judge people solely on the excellence of their work, we all rise higher together. As the gathering dispersed and Marcus prepared to leave, he paused for one last look at the exhibit, at the reconstructed cockpit where 15 years earlier he had made decisions that saved 157 lives and unexpectedly changed countless more. In that moment, he remembered his father's words from long ago. "They'll doubt you because of how you look, so no more than they do. Be better than they expect. Not because you should have to be, but because that's how change happens." His father had been right. Change had happened, not all at once, not completely, but significantly. And it had begun not with speeches or policies, but with excellence so undeniable it forced a reconsideration of long-held biases. As Marcus Johnson turned to join his family, he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that his legacy would continue in the careers of those he had mentored, in the lives of those he had saved, and in an industry forever changed by the recognition that excellence knows no color. And in the skies above America, pilots of all backgrounds would continue to fly, guided by his example and the simple, powerful truth he had demonstrated, that when competence is the only criterion, humanity soars to its greatest heights.